Projections show that by 2030, nearly half of Africa's inhabitants will be living in urban centers. Presently, it is estimated that a third of Africa's 1 billion inhabitants currently live in urban areas.
Over a third of Africa's 1 billion people currently live in urban areas. This is according to the UN Habitat. They say by the year 2030, that number will have risen to half. That's both good and bad, depending on how you look at it. Globally, urbanization has been associated with improved human development, rising resources, and better living standards. According to projections by UN Habitat, the population of some African cities is set to swell by up to 85% in the next 15 years. Africa's most populous city in 2010, Cairo, will grow by 23% to 13.5 million people. By 2025, however, it will have been overtaken by Lagos, whose population is projected to hit 15.8 million, and Kinshasa, 15 million. The surge into African cities appears to overwhelm government planners and policymakers. The outcome is that slum-dwellers currently account for 70% of urban populations. Food and water shortage, poor infrastructure, and a lack of housing are among the problems faced by governments as Africa rapidly urbanizes. UN Habitat reports that conditions in African cities are now the most unequal in the world. The pattern is oceans of poverty containing islands of wealth, according to the UN agency. This scenario, it says, could spell disaster unless urgent action is initiated immediately. The situation threatens stability of individual nations as well as the continent. On the brighter side, though, Africa has everything it needs to turn urbanization into an opportunity to uplift millions from poverty. Not only does it have a young and vigorous population, but the continent's overall economic growth of around 6% is higher than many other regions in the world. Africa also has enough space for infrastructure development and increased food production. However, progress will require well-devised public policies that steer demographic growth, create urban economies, and ensure equitable distribution of wealth.
So is urbanization a bad or a good thing? Well, joining us to put some perspective on what a rapidly urbanizing Africa means is Professor Edward Moreno, the Head of Research and Capacity Development, UN Habitat. Also joining us, Mr. Chris Odwor, Program Officer, Institute of Economic Affairs, joining us here in studio. Gentlemen, welcome to Talk Africa. Professor Moreno, I'm going to start off with you. Let's look at the statistics today as far as urbanization, the global urbanization is concerned. 3.5 billion people today living in urban centers. By 2030, projected to reach 5 billion for Africa. Over 500 million will be living in urban centers by 2030. Now, capacity as it stands is already unable to meet demand. Can Africa meet its urban demand?
Let me start by telling you that urbanization is a very positive force. There is no country in the history of humanity that has developed, that has created wealth without urbanizing. Africa today has the lowest level of urbanization in all the world, but it's catching up very fast. Today is also the region in the world that is growing the fastest, 2 times fast than the global average.
Paint the picture for us, though, in terms of Africa. I mean, it is the region with the lowest rate of urbanization, but the fastest rate, and is catching up with the rest of the world. Paint for us the picture for Africa.
The picture could be very positive or could be negative, depending the way you look at urbanization. But urbanization is a transformative force. It brings better institutions, it brings democracy, it brings empowerment for women, it brings industrialization urbanization. The important thing to understand is that as you urbanize, you need to cater for this process of urbanization. You need to create conditions to receive the people moving from rural areas. You should not stop them. You need to create conditions for them. You need to create conditions for the middle class to develop. You need to develop infrastructure, connectivity of the city, better jobs. And it's possible to do that. And to some extent, for instance, Nairobi is doing that. but with some things that we can analyze. But at the general level, I can tell you that urbanization, as it grows, as it's developed, Africa will bring a great opportunity. And let me look in this perspective.
I'm going to cut you there for a minute because I want Chris's perspective on this. Do you agree that Africa's urbanization is a force for good?
Yeah, I'm totally in agreement. Just giving the example of Kenya, for instance, we know that Nairobi contributes around 60% to the national GDP, which is a very clear indicator that urban areas are actually areas that can enhance economic development. And as the good professor says, all you need to do is to provide good conditions that will encourage this economic growth. Yes.
But Professor, you're talking about what can happen, you know, with urbanization for Africa. But what is the most critical challenge, though, for Africa's planners at the moment?
There are several. One is that this process of urbanization, 3.5% every year, which means that in 18 years, the population of Nairobi will double. It means that you need to look at where they are going to come. You need to create some conditions in terms of planned land, some expansion, some infrastructure development, to avoid that all the urbanization is done in a context of slums. Today in Kenya, from 100 new people coming to the city or living here, 60% go directly to slum areas. So you need to avoid this slum reproduction.
What is lacking to ensure that to enable people move into the slums? What is it that is lacking in Africa's urban cities?
What is lacking is that, for instance, land in terms of real estate developments, housing or apartments, or just land in urban areas, is not affordable for the poor. It's extremely expensive. There are very few programs, public programs, that can respond to the needs of the poor. So what the government needs to do, what the private sector, what civil society need to do, is to create conditions to plan in advance this growth, offer land that is accessible for them, and some level of basic infrastructure that can develop over time. But what you need to avoid is that the city grows without infrastructure. Bringing this infrastructure later is extremely expensive, and conditions will be not met for the city to develop.
You're talking about what needs to be done, though, but what is being done?
It has been done some things. For instance, no one can deny it in the case of Nairobi, there is a very important infrastructure development in terms of roads. But also, no one can deny that this infrastructure development is still low. For instance, on average, if you take similar cities in the developed world, 3 to 4 million inhabitants, the percentage of streets that they have will be half of the total area of the city, 30–40%. Nairobi is only 9%. So you need more streets, you need more connectivity, you need public transport. The public transport in Nairobi is substituted now by matatu solutions. But this is private solutions that are responding to the lack of a public real transport.
All right. Chris, though, you work in areas of governance and I think capacity building here. Are you confident, though, that Africa's governments are taking the necessary measures to ensure that Africa's cities catch up with city needs?
Some effort definitely is being put in, but then I strongly believe that the game needs to be upped in the sense that, for instance, we know as a matter of fact, that our urban areas are really growing very fast because we are having a great number of people coming in from the rural areas in search of an employment. But then the first challenge that they face once they come to our urban areas is that we do not have adequate housing. And as Professor has mentioned, what then we would need is mass housing and houses which are affordable to the very poor. And once we do that, then we are going to create conducive environments, living environments for the poor, which definitely contributes towards their productivity and which will, at the end of the day, for an economist, really contribute towards economic development of our continent. So though effort is being put into it, there's need for inclusivity in terms of even the policies and even the decisions that are being made in terms of development. Because if you look, let's pick for instance the city of Nairobi. We are now working on the development of the road infrastructure. The big question would be, what are we really focusing on? Because we have a large number of people who can't afford vehicles yet need to move to their places of work. But then are we really providing necessary infrastructure in terms of, let's say, even walking areas or even cycling areas for these people to move so that they can get from one point to another?
So we're looking at Africa cities now, burgeoning, bulging at the seams because of, influx and planned masses and so forth and so on. What would it take to make Africa's cities better planned?
I would tell you a related set of things. The first one, you need, and I think the Kenyan government is doing that, to review the laws and institutions to make sure that resources are well coordinated, are well in terms of accountability and management. You need also to create urban plans that will look at the form and the function of the city to avoid great developments outside the city, because they generate cost in consumption of energy. They produce even CO2 in terms of climate change and things like this. But it will be very difficult for the city to manage the urbanization process if you are not controlling it in terms of planning and management. And to do that, you need institutions, but you need also a strong civil society that will ask for these rights.
All right, Chris, what are you seeing from your assessment, though? What are you seeing as some of the critical factors that are needed to ensure that Africa's urbanization is on course?
First of all, the issue of governance. We know that we have plans, and all you need to do is to stick to the plans that we have. For instance, if we are going to develop roads, we know that there have been encroachment on road reserves. So what we need to do is a good governance system which will ensure that all stakeholders with the different interests do not affect service delivery in terms of, for instance, the development of whether it's roads or railway lines, by not encroaching into these spaces that are actually provided for the same. So governance is a very critical element in this particular instance.
All right, gentlemen, we'll take a short break here. We'll return to this discussion in a moment. Professor Edward Moreno joining us here from UN Habitat, and Chris Odwor, Program Officer, Institute of Economic Affairs. Do stay with us. We will return in just a moment. Welcome back to Talk Africa. So how can Africa tap into urbanization to lift the living standards of its people? Well, joining us now from Johannesburg, Mr. Blessing Rugara, the Chief Executive at the Circle Capital Global, and still here in studio with me, Professor Edward Moreno, Head of Research and Capacity Development, UN Habitat, and Chris Odwor, Program Officer, Institute of Economic Affairs. Blessing, in Johannesburg, let me get to you first. We've had statistics about Africa's rapid rate of urbanization, and in under 15 years, there'll be over 500 million Africans living in African cities. Now, Professor Moreno did point out that rapid growth and urbanization is not necessarily, or has not necessarily been, a bad thing for Africa. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think urbanization for Africa is a fantastic thing. It's happening all over the world. I think there's a bit of misunderstanding or perhaps a distinction that needs to be drawn between the rapid growth of urban populations and urbanization. Because it's not only the movement of people from rural settings to urban settings, but it's also the high population growth rates through births in African cities, and then also people moving from one city to another. So I think the issue that's faced by African cities is really beyond urbanization, to build enough infrastructure and social services to encompass all of these African people and others who are moving for various reasons to the great African cities.
Are African cities, though, coping, Blessing, in this regard?
Well, I think you'd have to say no at this point, because we have far too many slums and too little infrastructure to deal with the demand that we are seeing for services and for houses, schools, hospitals in African cities, from Cape to Cairo.
Well, when you look at it, though, Blessing, as you listen to that whole debate about urban development and, you know, the migration you're talking about, what are some of your biggest concerns?
Well, I think the biggest concern I would have is that African governments have to show the capacity to create the right policy and right macroeconomic environments that will allow for the financing of the infrastructure that's needed to deliver social services. And in order to do that effectively, they are going to have to figure out ways of partnering with the private sector in order to access capital that is not readily available to government through taxes, and perhaps would be more available through capital markets from around the world for servicing African infrastructure needs.
Is it showing, though, that public-private sector initiatives there, in terms of the way you talk about it, is it showing any good signs? Is it showing that it actually works in this sense? Can it work in this sense?
I think so. Absolutely. I think that we've seen lots of different initiatives in various parts of the continent. Here in Johannesburg and in South Africa, you're seeing a lot of infrastructure development being done between the private sector and the public sector. I think a number of different airports around the continent have been built using capital from private sources. You also see that African countries have been very successful in terms of raising bonds, Euro bonds, for instance, for use in infrastructure development across the continent.
All right. Professor, you're going to have to expound on that a little bit for us. Now, the rapid growth and urbanization, as you mentioned, not necessarily being about a bad thing. Expound that for us.
Yes, let me tell you that he's correct in something. I wouldn't say I disagree in the other part, but I think it's a partial view. He's correct that if you take Africa, the last figures, 20% of the growth of urban areas is due to the change of status of land from rural to urban. 20% is to the migration from rural to urban, and 60% is natural growth. Natural growth, that he mentioned, is the most important driver of factor of urbanization in Africa. So all these three require specific policies. It's not only about macroeconomics. To me, it's the understanding, and I think is where some governments are failing or not really benefiting from the process, to understand the transformative force that urbanization represents. And national policies, not only economic, national policies in general, should use more cities for this national development. And for that, you need a national urban policy. You need to understand in the geography of your country, which is the role that the big city and the small city play, which is the role that the capital city in a coastal area or in the center of the country play. This geography, these factors, this urbanization should be looked at this process of the system of cities, how cities can converge and contribute to urbanization. It's not only macroeconomics. When you look at that, you would understand that some cities have some potentials that is not really tapped. This potential, these possibilities for some cities to develop will require a specific acupuncture policies, a specific touches in the city that could be one city to become an university, other to become an industrial area, other one to become an administrative center. These kind of policies are not very clearly developed. Right. Therefore, the actions will not be always be the more efficient in terms of policy.
All right, Blessing, do you agree though that it is more about lack of national policies or federal policies though that are making cities stagnant in Africa, more or less than financing?
Well, I do believe that urban planning is a critical element in the puzzle. But once you've done your plans, you're going to have to figure out a way to finance those plans. And certainly the bigger challenge that African governments have at this moment is finding ways to finance the aspirations for good infrastructure that Africans all over the continent have.
Is there a way though? Yes, Professor, you.
It's true what he's saying, but one of the best mechanisms to finance infrastructure in countries or in cities is the same process of urbanization. You need to capture the benefits of urbanization that today are only captured by the private sector for their own benefit, and to bring these benefits to the public realm, to public and national and local authorities, to create good policies and good redistributive mechanisms through good governance, as he mentioned, and to make sure that the urbanization process is generating wealth that can be beneficial for everyone. It's not only about the macroeconomics. I don't dispute that macroeconomics are important. Of course, they are obviously very important. But I think there has been an excessive concentration in the notion of prosperity through macroeconomics, whereas the capacity of different levels of government to generate income and resources should be more exploited.
I noticed though, you know, in Nairobi, for instance, taxes and levies have gone up dramatically, say, under the new governor, for instance, but the services, to my estimation, pretty much stay the same. So what works best, though, in terms of financing? I mean, is there a way to finance development not through direct levies?
You need levies and you need different taxes, but some of these taxes, they don't need necessarily to be paid by all. For instance, when you do a new urbanization project, as Nairobi is doing in some areas,
right,
through real estate developers, these real estate developers are taking a right in terms of in public infrastructure that they are not paying,
right,
to create economic benefits for them. If you create, for instance, redistributive policies in terms of value capture of the land and the infrastructure that is generated in those areas, these specific areas could generate conditions to generate better quality of life in the whole space. Of course, you also need, as you mentioned, accountability. Money is generated, but we need to look better where and how it's being used and expand. And once that you know that, to make sure that everyone is taking benefiting from this process.
We're going to let Blessing go in a moment, but I just want to get your view here, Blessing. What policies should be in place to make African cities more attractive and more competitive? What is required?
Well, I think in the first part, African cities have to ensure that they are up to date in terms of the services that the citizenry requires. Firstly, you want to make sure that your health services are first rate. You want to make sure your educational services are first rate. You want to make sure that housing is available for people, and that housing is decent housing that people can be proud to live in. You also want to make sure that your transportation system is cost effective and available to be able to take people to the places that they need to go to. All of those things require capital. And so I don't argue with the professor that it's not purely a money issue, but I do assert that at the end of the day, you must have the economic wherewithal, the planning necessary, and the various instruments of capital available to you in order to cover the gulf that's been really created over centuries, where African cities are not adequately infrastructured in order to serve the populations in the various countries.
All right, Professor Moreno, we're going to come to you for that comment you want to make, but I'm going to let Blessing Rugara leave us for the moment, Chief Executive, Circle Capital Global. Thank you very much for joining us here on Talk Africa from Johannesburg. Professor Moreno, I'll turn to you. You had a comment there, though, but then I'm also going to put it to you. If you had your way, though, because you have some pretty strong views about, you know, financing and how to make a city work. If you had your way, how would you design the perfectly workable African city, and how would you fund it?
Very good. First, you need to think in a city that the model of urbanization is more functional, which means you need to have a city that is more compact, that people will live together as much as possible, not always possible, but as much as possible in a walkable or in a manner that can get access to proximity services. This requires planning, first thing. Second, you need to think in terms of moving one people to another. And for that, you need sound public transport, which is missing in many African countries, Nairobi, to take an example. Third, you will need institutions and laws that will enable you to see where there are opportunities. I fully agree with the last comment of him when you ask what cities can do, but there is something that they can do also. Each city has what people from geography mention as location factors or comparative advantages factors. Each city has a specific potential. Obviously, you need resources, but resources can be tapped from different ways. One is national policies. The cities that work the better in the world today are the cities that manage to convince the national government to give them resources. In other words, are cities that create good comparative advantages, good plans for development, and have convincing the leaders to bring resources from the national government, from the private sector. So you need leadership. You need very strong institutions and leadership that will enable you to portray a vision of the city that you will respect over time. This is the vision of my city in the next 10 years, and society and everyone would make what is necessary to move towards that direction. All right,
Chris, you have the final comment on this.
Yeah, even as we continue to urbanize, I think it will be very important that we recognize the issue of informality and sort of somehow legitimize it. Because unless we do that, then some challenges like insecurity will still bedevil us. Because we know that a very large percentage of our populations in the urban areas in Africa live in the informal settlement, which in some instances have caused insecurity challenges, which has an effect on the investors who want to come to our cities. And that might actually affect the growth of our urban areas. So the issue of governance is very, very critical as we go about this issue of urbanization and handling.
All right, Chris Odwor, Program Officer, Institute of Economic Affairs, and Professor Edward Moreno, Head of Research and Capacity Development at UN Habitat. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us here on the program. This has been Talk Africa from Nairobi. I'm Beatrice Marshall. Goodbye.